She was once called a she-wolf, but by the end, she was just a shadow in exile. They say queens are born to rule, but what happens when a queen outlives her kingdom? When her crown becomes a chain, her palace a prison, and her name an echo no one dares to answer? Margaret of Anjou did not die in a royal bed, nor was she mourned by a nation. She died in a borrowed room in France, forgotten. Stripped of power, husband, child, and homeland, she was once the most feared woman in England, and yet, at the end, she had less than a beggar. They called her the she-wolf of France. But even wolves need a pack. Even wolves can be hunted. Her life began in silk, but ended in silence. Her hands once gripped the reins of armies. But when she died, they were empty. Why? How does a queen fall so far, so utterly, so irrevocably? This is not a tale of romance, nor one of grandeur. This is the story of power turned poison, of ambition drowned in blood, of a mother who fought like a lioness, only to lose everything she ever loved. And above all, this is the story of what happens when history decides. You no longer matter before the blood, before the screams, before her name became a curse whispered by trembling courtiers. There was a girl, and she danced in the sunlight. Margaret of Anjou was born in March 1430 in the Kingdom of Naples, at the Chateau of Pont-à-Mousson in Lorraine. To the world, she was a daughter of royalty, but in those early years, she was just Marguerite. A curious child with olive skin, cold dark eyes, and a laugh that bounced like wind chimes through the garden courtyards. Her father, René of Anjou, was a dreamer, an artist king, a poet with a crown that barely clung to his head. He ruled over titles more than land: King of Naples, Duke of Anjou, Count of Provence, and yet held little real power. Her mother, Isabella of Lorraine, was the iron in the family's spine, a warrior in a silk gown. From her, Margaret would learn the art of endurance, the grace beneath pressure, and the smile that hides defiance. Their court was not like those of London or Paris. It had no glittering wealth, no lavish masquerades, but it had warmth. Books were everywhere. Paintings lined the halls, music floated through the air like incense, and in the middle of it all, Margaret thrived. She rode horses before she could read. She learned Latin while plucking violets. She memorized the Psalms and then questioned them. There was something fierce in her even then, not rebellious, just alert, sharp, as if she already sensed the world would not be kind to her, so she must be sharper than its blade. At dusk, she would sit by the balcony and watch the sun disappear behind the hills of Provence. "Will it rise again?" she once asked a nurse. "It always rises again," came the reply. But years later, Margaret would learn. Some lights do not return. Some days end forever. She had no idea she was being prepared for war, not with swords and armor, but with words and silence, with glances exchanged between ambassadors, with letters sealed in red wax and sent across the Channel. For England was breaking. King Henry VI, a fragile, pious monarch, was in need of a wife who could unite the fractured peace between France and England, a wife who could bear him sons, a wife who could command where he could not. And Margaret, at just 14, became that answer. Not by her will, but by her blood. She was betrothed in absence. her marriage negotiated like the terms of a ceasefire, her body promised as diplomacy, her future signed away by men who had never heard her laugh. When the day of departure came, she stood on the deck of a ship bound for England. Her hair twisted into braids too tight, her dress too heavy for her frame. Below the ship, the sea churned like a restless prophecy. Above, the sky stretched wide and silent. Her mother held her face, kissed her forehead. "Be proud," she whispered. "You carry us all." But Margaret did not cry. She only stared forward, not at the waves, but at the horizon, as if already sensing that this crossing was not a journey, but a goodbye. In her trunk, she carried no crown, just letters, prayers, a rosary of amber beads, and a small painted portrait of her parents, now fading at the edges. She would keep it near her for decades, until the day even that memory faded. And so began the story, not of a queen, but of a girl, barely a woman, thrust into the jaws of a dying empire. A lamb walking into a house full of wolves. But Margaret was no lamb. She would learn, she would adapt, and she would strike. But that was still far away. For now, she was still a daughter, still a sister, still innocent, and perhaps, in some alternate thread of time, if England had been kinder, if the crown less heavy, we would have remembered her differently. Not as a monster, not as a she-wolf, but simply as Margaret, the girl who once danced in the sunlight. She arrived in England in 1445, not as a stranger, but as a symbol. 15 years old, draped in French silk, eyes sharp like polished onyx. They dressed her in pearls, but it was the weight of expectation that choked her. She was not just a bride, she was a treaty. Her marriage to King Henry VI of England was the final thread in the fragile tapestry of peace, known as the Truce of Tours, a last-ditch effort to still the bloodshed between England and France during the 100 Years' War. In exchange, no dowry was given. Instead, Henry agreed to cede Maine, a bitter pill that infuriated his court. And yet the English people were told to celebrate, to smile at the girl they now called their queen. But Margaret saw the truth, even behind the smiles. She was not welcomed. She was tolerated. The court was a nest of vipers, nobles divided between Yorkists and Lancastrians, each whispering daggers behind velvet curtains. And Henry, her husband, her king, was not a man made for war. He was pious, gentle, bookish. He spent more time in prayer than in parliament. He was not cruel. He was not foolish. But he was absent. He ruled from a distance, even while sitting on the throne. And Margaret, barely a woman, quickly realized what the kingdom already knew. The king was too fragile to lead, and England was bleeding. At court, the nobles watched her, a French woman, young, ambitious, and worst of all, intelligent. She learned fast. She learned how power whispered, not shouted, how it moved not in decrees, but in shadows, in patronage, in alliances forged over goblets of poisoned wine. And so, she aligned herself with William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, her countryman and closest political ally. He had arranged her marriage. Now he taught her how to wield power in a kingdom that did not want her voice. But it came at a cost. The people resented Suffolk. They blamed him for the loss of Maine, for the taxes, for the French bride they called a parasite. And when Margaret defended him, when she spoke on his behalf, they blamed her too. In 1450, Suffolk was arrested, exiled, and assassinated at sea, his headless body washing ashore. It was not just a death, it was a warning. Even queens are not immune. And yet, Margaret did not retreat. She grew bolder. She surrounded herself with loyal Lancastrians, funded by royal favor. In 1453, she gave birth to Prince Edward of Westminster, the long-awaited heir. But the joy was short-lived. That same year, King Henry VI suffered a complete mental breakdown. For over a year, he was catatonic, unable to speak, move, or recognize even his own son. The kingdom fell into chaos, and Margaret took control. She convened councils, she issued orders, she positioned allies, she ruled in all but name, a queen not of bloodline, but of action, and they hated her for it. They called her overbearing, manipulative, power-hungry. She-wolf, some spat behind closed doors. Because in a kingdom where men failed, a woman who stood up was deemed unnatural. Then came Richard, Duke of York, ambitious, calculating, a distant cousin of the king with his eyes set on the throne. Under the guise of protecting the realm, he marched on London and demanded to be made protector of the realm during the king's illness. Parliament agreed. In Margaret's eyes, it was treason thinly veiled as duty, a vulture circling a crown. And in that moment, the lines were drawn. The country was no longer ruled by a king. It was ruled by factions. The first blood of the Wars of the Roses had not yet been spilled, but the ground was already soaked in distrust. Margaret, still barely in her 20s, stood in a world cracking beneath her feet. Her husband, the crown's ghost, her son, the target of every ambition, and herself, a foreign queen expected to smile, stay silent, and fade politely into the background. But she would not fade. They had married her to a king who couldn't rule. So she would become the ruler instead, not because she wanted to, but because no one else would protect what was hers. And in doing so, she crossed a line few women in her time dared. She entered the battlefield, not with a sword, but with fury sharper than steel. She spoke when silence was expected. She acted where her husband disappeared. And from that moment on, history began writing her story in blood. They wanted her silent. They wanted her submissive. Instead, they got a storm. By 1455, the tension that had simmered beneath England's crown erupted. And it began not with proclamations, but with blood spilled on a country lane just north of London. The First Battle of St. Albans. It was supposed to be a negotiation, a meeting of nobles. But what began as talk ended in slaughter. The Lancastrians, led by King Henry VI and his loyalists, were ambushed by the Yorkists, commanded by Richard, Duke of York, and his ally Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker. Henry was captured. His closest allies lay dead, and Margaret was nowhere near the battlefield. But she felt the blade all the same. She was no longer just a queen. She was the widow of a living husband, the mother of a threatened son, and the last shield between her child and annihilation. They wanted to strip the House of Lancaster to its bones, and Margaret would not let them. She began to raise troops in the north. She brokered alliances in Scotland. She even turned to France, her motherland, for aid, anything. Anything to keep Edward, her son, safe from the Yorkist wolves. And this time, she did not send messengers. She led armies herself. England had never seen a queen like this. She marched in armor. She commanded strategy. At the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, her forces decimated the Yorkists. Richard of York, once her rival, once the man who dared challenge her son's claim, was killed. His head was placed on a pike above Micklegate Bar in York, adorned mockingly with a paper crown. It was vengeance. Not just for herself, but for every humiliation she had swallowed, every whisper, every lie. But war has no mercy, and triumph is always temporary. In 1461, the tide turned again. At the Battle of Towton, the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, the Yorkists, led by Edward, Earl of March, Richard's son, crushed the Lancastrians. It was Palm Sunday. Snow fell sideways, mixing with the blood of over 20,000 men. Margaret fled north. King Henry, fragile and near mute, was taken once more, and Edward IV was declared king. The crown she had once held now sat on the head of the man who had killed her dreams. But she still had one reason to fight, one flicker of defiance. Her son, Edward of Westminster. He was 12, quiet, serious, raised in the echo of conflict. But he believed in her, called her my lioness, and in return, she wrapped her soul around him like armor. Together, they fled to France, exiled, hunted, vilified. She paced the halls of Bar-le-Duc, planning, pleading, negotiating with foreign kings. She became a queen without a court, a general without an army. But her voice never trembled. Then, in 1470, a miracle. The Yorkists fractured. Warwick the Kingmaker, once her greatest enemy, turned against Edward IV. In a twist too strange for fiction, he allied with Margaret, even betrothing his daughter to Prince Edward, the very boy he had once tried to destroy. It was a devil's handshake. But Margaret accepted, because in politics, mercy is weakness. They returned to England in 1471, triumphant. It was supposed to be the restoration of the Lancastrian crown, but fate, once again, turned its knife. Just days before her arrival, Warwick was killed at the Battle of Barnet. Her ally, her gamble, gone, and worse was coming. Margaret and her son pressed on. With Henry VI in the Tower and her enemies scattered, she still believed victory could be seized. One last push, one final battle, and so came Tewkesbury, May 4th, 1471, a rolling field in Gloucestershire. The Lancastrians, exhausted, disoriented. The Yorkists, disciplined, waiting. Margaret stood near the rear, her son at the front. He was just 17, and he died screaming. Some say he was captured and executed. Others claim he died in battle. But all accounts agree. Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales, was killed that day. The only heir Margaret had. The only thread of meaning she clung to. They brought her the news as she was dragged from the battlefield. She did not scream. She did not faint. She simply stopped, as if something inside her, once fire, had turned to ash. She was taken prisoner, led in chains past the sneering faces of her enemies. And from that moment, she would never again walk freely on English soil. The battlefield took her son, but England was not done with her yet. After the crushing defeat at Tewkesbury, Margaret of Anjou was captured. She was no longer a queen, no longer even a threat, just a woman. Blood-stained, widowed in spirit, her title carved out like a tumor. They brought her to London in chains. It is easy to romanticize captivity. A tower, a window, a sigh. But Margaret's prison was not poetry. It was bricks and rot, cold stone, and a kingdom that had no room left for mercy. She was held in the Tower of London, the same fortress where her husband, Henry VI, would die within weeks of her son's fall. Some say it was murder. His skull later found with damage consistent with blunt force trauma. Officially, he died of melancholy. But in England's twisted theater of power, death rarely needed an honest curtain. Margaret was not even told immediately. When the news reached her, she said nothing. Not a word, not a tear, just a long, flat stare. As if grief had folded itself so tightly within her that even expression became a betrayal. For over a year, she was held without dignity. She was no longer addressed as queen, no longer allowed attendance. The woman who once dictated royal marriages and commanded armies now relied on jailers to bring her water, and her body began to break. Contemporary accounts speak of her pallor, of eyes that did not blink, of a voice hollow as wind between tombs. She was barely 41, but her back curved like someone carrying the weight of 2 graves. She slept poorly, refused food. Some days she spoke Latin psalms aloud until her voice cracked. Other days, nothing at all. She had entered England decades earlier as a bride. Now she sat behind iron, no kingdom, no allies, the smell of mold and urine clinging to her like a second skin. And across the Channel, France, her homeland, stood silent. Louis XI, King of France, offered no immediate help. Though he was her cousin, he had little love for Margaret. She had once refused his overtures. Now, he let her rot. Politics rarely remembers blood when power is at stake. It was not until 1475, 4 years into her captivity, that Louis finally agreed to negotiate her release. Why? Because Edward IV of England needed peace. And peace, as always, was currency. Under the Treaty of Picquigny, England and France exchanged pleasantries and promises, and among the terms, Margaret would be ransomed. For 50,000 crowns, a queen's worth reduced to a ledger entry. And so, after 4 years of chains, 4 years of damp walls and unseen weeping, Margaret was led to a ship bound for France. But this was not a homecoming. She arrived not as a queen returning to her homeland, but as a political leftover. She was housed in castles belonging to the French crown, but not out of honor. They were more like gilded cages, comfortable, yes, but suffocating in another way. She was placed in Anjou, then later Saumur, and finally Dampierre-sur-Loire, a lonely manor near the banks of the river, far from any court or capital. There were no banquets, no processions, no poems sung in her name, just servants who had never heard of her, and a garden that grew wild with thorns. She walked its paths each morning, sometimes barefoot, sometimes murmuring her son's name, Edward, Edward, Edward. It was as if saying it aloud kept his ghost from fading. But ghosts are not so obedient. Her health continued to fail. Arthritis, some believed. Malnutrition, Others suspected. But more than that, she suffered from the illness history never dares to name. A life without purpose. The once sharp queen, who had penned treaties and commanded battalions, now sat for hours beside the fire, unmoving, looking not at the flames, but at something behind them, something no one else could see. Witnesses describe her as withdrawn from this world. She kept a single painted miniature of her son by her bed. She refused visitors. She spoke of England only to curse its soil. And yet, she never once begged to return. She knew what exile meant, and chose it over ever again, bowing to a crown that had devoured her child. Her body withered, but her bitterness remained, untouched. On August 25th, 1482, Margaret of Anjou died. No fanfare, no mourning bell, just a quiet, uneventful end in the corner of a house that was not hers. She was buried at Angers Cathedral, beside her parents, not as a queen, but simply as Marguerite. The woman who once ruled England in all but name, now lay beneath French stone with no crown, no heir, no legacy but ruin. And yet, even in death, the echoes of her footsteps still disturbed England's dreams. For she had dared to fight, not as a queen made by men, but as a mother made by loss. And history, no matter how it tried, could not silence that. The body breaks first, but the mind unravels slowly. At Dampierre-sur-Loire, Margaret no longer lived among courtiers or commands. She lived among echoes, and they answered her. There were whispers in the walls. She would pause mid-step, turn suddenly, as if someone had called her name, softly, urgently, from another world. But the room was always empty, except for her and the portrait. It sat by her bedside, always angled just so. A miniature of her son, Edward of Westminster, painted years before his death. His eyes frozen in eternal youth, a face untouched by war, by steel, by the betrayal of kings. Each morning she greeted it. "Good day, my prince," she whispered. "Have you eaten?" And then she would serve a second plate at her table. Bread, water, a slice of apple, left untouched. But she waited patiently, as if he might someday take a bite. It was grief, they said. Understandable, acceptable even. But grief, left too long alone, grows teeth. By 1480, her servants had learned not to question. When she laughed suddenly at nothing, they smiled politely. When she screamed in her sleep, they barred the windows. One night, they found her kneeling in the garden, barefoot, mud-soaked, speaking Latin into the moonlight. "Domine quo vadis?" "Lord, where are you going?" They say she was trying to summon her husband. Not Henry the King, but Henry the Soul. The man she had watched slip into silence before England finished the job. She believed he was trapped between worlds. "Not in heaven," she muttered once, "but in the walls." Walls. Always the walls. She would trace her fingers across the stone, lips moving silently, as if reading messages carved by invisible hands, or replying to voices only she could hear. Some dismissed it as madness. Others, more superstitious, believed she had crossed into a space between life and death, where memory and spirit tangled like vines. Even her attendants, hardened by war and poverty, spoke of a presence in the house, footsteps where none should be, candles snuffed out, windows opening by themselves during storms. But whether real or hallucinated, Margaret had ceased to live among the living. She wore black, always. Not for fashion, not for mourning, but for ritual. For her, every day was a funeral. And still, she retained structure. Each dawn, prayers. Each dusk, conversation with the portrait. She believed Edward was growing. Once she asked for new boots to be made for him. His feet must be larger now, she told the cobbler. He is nearly a man. He nodded and made them. What else could he do? They humored her because she had once been a queen, because the blood of kings still ran through her veins, even if that blood had grown cold, and because there was something terrifying about her certainty. She did not seem confused. She did not forget names, dates, places. No. Her mind was sharp, only pointed toward a world no one else could see. It was not senility. It was something deeper, a grief so profound it rewrote reality. Even the clergy were cautious. When the local priest came to offer communion, she waved him away. "I already dine with angels," she said. "They speak Latin better than you." And yet, there were glimpses, moments when the fog parted and the old queen stared out from within the broken woman. She once told a maid, "They say I was cruel, but I was merely awake in a kingdom of sleepwalkers." Another time, gazing into the Loire River, England was a mirror, and in it, I saw myself rot. Then she turned, smiled faintly, and asked if the lilies had bloomed yet. Though it was January and the garden lay buried in frost. It was paranoia, yes, but also clarity, like the cracked reflections on broken glass. Sharp, painful, true. She believed spies still watched her, that Edward IV sent ravens to perch on her roof and report her mutterings. She sometimes buried scraps of parchment in the soil, notes she wrote in cipher. One servant once dug one up. It read, "They sleep thinking they have won, but the dead do not forgive." By 1481, she rarely left her chamber. Her body ached, her vision blurred, but her mind remained on fire, a fire that did not warm, only burned. She began to speak to statues, to birds, to her own reflection, and then, finally, to herself. Long, rambling monologues that no one dared interrupt. She relived every loss, her wedding, her betrayal, Suffolk's death, York's rebellion, Edward's blood, Henry's silence. The tower, the tower, the tower. That word returned often, like an infection, as if the walls of that place still lived inside her. Some say she died before she died, that by the final year her body was merely the shell of something already gone. A ghost, waiting to be caught by the wind. And in those haunted halls of Dampierre, the woman once feared as the she-wolf of France had become something even more tragic. A mother speaking to shadows, because they were all she had left. It did not come with thunder. It did not come with poison or blade. It came quietly, like a curtain falling in a room no one entered anymore. August 25th, 1482. In a crumbling manor near the Loire River, Margaret of Anjou, the Queen of England, the Lioness of Lancaster, the she-wolf of France, took her final breath. No trumpet sounded, no bells tolled. The world did not pause. But inside her body, the last empire collapsed. For months, her health had withered like fruit left too long on the branch. Her hands trembled constantly, her spine curled in on itself. She moved as if walking through water, slow, heavy, drowning by inches. She no longer ate. She spoke only in fragments, and her skin, once olive and flushed with battle heat, grew waxy, translucent, like melted parchment stretched over brittle bones. Witnesses said her room smelled of iron and lavender, but beneath that, decay. Not of the body yet, but of the mind. A rot that had started not in her flesh, but in her memory. They found her that morning in her bed, one hand clutched to her chest, the other resting atop the portrait of her son, the same miniature she had carried for over a decade. Its paint faded, corners chipped, as if time had chewed on it in the dark. She had not cried out. She had not struggled. She had simply stopped. Some said her heart gave out. Others whispered stroke, seizure, even divine release. But no physician was summoned. There was no autopsy, because there was no one left who needed an answer. To the world, she had already died years ago. Now, her body had simply caught up. No foreign dignitaries came to claim her. No English lords demanded ceremony. No king sent roses. Only the local clergy of Anjou prepared her burial. She was washed, wrapped in linen, and placed in a coffin of plain wood. Not oak, not cedar, just pine. Her death was recorded in a single line in a provincial register. La reine Marguerite est décédée, le 25 août. Dieu la garde. Queen Margaret has died, August 25th. May God keep her. And that was all. There was no state funeral, no crown placed upon her coffin, not even a royal standard to drape over her bones. The woman who once ruled armies, who stood against kings and parliament and betrayal, was lowered into the ground beneath Angers Cathedral, quiet, unannounced, unwanted. There were no surviving children to carry her memory, no court historian to lionize her last words. If she had any final breath of defiance, it vanished with the wind that rustled the leaves above her grave. They say the coffin creaked as it was lowered, as if wood itself recoiled at housing so much pain. Inside, her fingers still clutched the portrait of Edward. It was buried with her. One final act of defiance. If England would not remember her, at least she would carry her son into the dark. Her tomb bore no elaborate epitaph, just a name. Marguerite d'Anjou, not queen, not mother, not wife. Just a name on cold stone, a name that once made men flinch, now flaked into silence by rain and lichen. And yet, even in death, the grotesquerie lingered. The clergy who buried her later spoke of strange things. A sudden wind during the rite, though no window was open. A candle that flickered and died the moment the final prayer was uttered. A murmuring sound, low and aching, that seemed to echo from beneath the floor. Of course, these were dismissed. Old men, old minds, superstition. But one priest, in a letter long forgotten, wrote, "She died quiet, but she was never still." There are dead who rest, and there are dead who wander. I believe she walks still. Perhaps it was nonsense, but perhaps not. For what is more grotesque than a life of power that ends in powerlessness? What horror is more chilling than silence after a life of roar? Margaret did not die in public execution. She was not assassinated or overthrown in a blaze of drama. She was suffocated by history itself, starved of meaning, buried beneath indifference. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest death of all. Because pain can be remembered, but obscurity is a second grave. And Margaret of Anjou, once queen, once warrior, once mother, now belonged to no one. When Margaret of Anjou died in exile, no bells rang in England. No court paused. No king sent condolences. But something had ended. Not just a life, but a lineage, a war, a prophecy soaked in the blood of thousands. Her death marked the true end of the House of Lancaster, because by 1482, it was already a house in ruins. Her husband, Henry VI, dead in the Tower. Her son, Edward of Westminster, slain at Tewkesbury. And now she, the last living pillar, laid beneath French soil, forgotten by the land she once tried to rule. There were no Lancastrians left to claim the throne, and yet the war she helped ignite had not vanished. The Wars of the Roses had raged across 3 decades, torn through villages, spilled noble blood onto church floors, and rewritten the very structure of monarchy in England. And Margaret, whether villain or victim, stood at the heart of it. It was not just ambition that brought down the Lancasters. It was the failure of a king who could not command, the division of a court rotted from within, and a queen who refused to be silent when the silence was expected. When she died, England was ruled by Edward IV, a Yorkist king she had once tried to destroy. But even his crown trembled. He had seized power through blood, but blood has memory. Within a year of Margaret's death, Edward IV himself would die suddenly in 1483 at just 40 years old. His son, Edward V, would never be crowned. He and his brother, the famous princes in the Tower, vanished into legend and suspicion. And the throne passed to another Yorkist, Richard III, the brother of Edward IV, a man whose reign would last just 2 years before he too was overthrown. The wheel kept turning, faster, hungrier, and in 1485, 3 years after Margaret's burial, a new name emerged from the ashes: Henry Tudor, the son of Margaret Beaufort, a distant Lancaster heir through an illegitimate line, barely more than a political ghost. But the kingdom was ready for anything that wasn't York, ready to bury the war forever. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor defeated Richard III. Richard fell in the mud, crown lost, body mutilated. And with that, the Plantagenet era ended. Henry Tudor became Henry VII, and with his marriage to Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, he symbolically united the 2 warring houses, Lancaster and York. Red rose and white. And it's here, in this uneasy marriage of blood and necessity, that Margaret of Anjou's ghost re-enters history. Because it was her war, her survival, her refusal to bow, that forced the question England had tried to avoid. What happens when a woman refuses to lose? She had been the first queen to lead an army into battle, the first to openly challenge the authority of Parliament, the first to govern in her husband's absence with an iron will and unapologetic voice. And for that, she was punished. But also for that, she changed the rules. Her downfall signaled to the nobility what could happen when factionalism went unchecked. Her exile warned foreign monarchs about the instability of England's throne. Her loss left a power vacuum so wide, a Welsh outsider like Henry Tudor could walk through it. The wars she helped wage ultimately consumed her son, but they also burned the old structure of monarchy to its bones. After Margaret, queens would no longer be expected to merely smile and birth heirs. They would whisper in councils, influence alliances, hold power not just behind the throne, but alongside it. And yet, none of that helped her. The political cost of her life was massive. The personal cost, incalculable. Over 60,000 lives were lost in the Wars of the Roses. Entire noble families erased, fortunes destroyed. The social order shattered, only to be rebuilt under new hands, new symbols, new lies. And Margaret, the storm that raged at the center of it, was left out of the retelling. Because history prefers clean endings, triumphant kings, neatly resolved wars. But Margaret's ending wasn't clean. It was muddy, blood-clotted, whispered. She was neither victor nor victim. She was both. And in some ways, she still is. Her death did not end a war, but it closed a chapter. The chapter where queens were punished for power, where mothers were crushed for defiance, where silence was survival. And though no monument marks her place in England, the Tudor rose, that perfect blend of red and white, carries her legacy in every petal. Because Margaret's fight forced compromise, her fury made space for peace. And in the end, though her body lay in exile, her shadow remained on the English crown. History does not forgive women who fight like men. It records their fury, but not their fear. It etches their power in stone, but leaves their grief in dust. Margaret of Anjou was no exception. To some, she remains a monster. A foreign queen who brought civil war to English soil. A schemer, a manipulator. The she-wolf of France, as Shakespeare would later call her in Henry VI, Part 3. Bloodthirsty, shrill, unrelenting. In the bard's telling, she curses like a witch, gloats over the corpses of her enemies, and weeps only when the blade turns on her own. O tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide. It is one of the most famous lines ever written about her, and perhaps the most enduring. But it is also a lie, because Shakespeare's Margaret was written not for truth, but for Tudor propaganda. His audience lived under a dynasty that rose by defeating Margaret's legacy. Her downfall had to be just. Her ambition had to be unnatural. Her voice had to sound like sin. And so she became a caricature, not a queen, but a cautionary tale. But peel back the politics, and another Margaret emerges. A girl married off at 15 to a man who could not rule. A woman who watched her husband descend into mental darkness, while nobles tore her child's birthright from beneath her feet. What did they expect her to do? Smile? Kneel? Pray quietly as history erased her? She chose to fight. Not out of thirst for blood, but from the most human instinct of all. To protect her child. Modern historians are divided. Some, like Paul Murray Kendall, criticize her as being the real instigator of civil war, accusing her of fueling conflict beyond reason, of refusing compromise even when peace was possible. Others, like Helen Maurer and Joan Kirby, offer a softer view. They argue that Margaret's actions were not born of greed, but of desperation. That in a kingdom collapsing under male incompetence, she did what no one else dared. She acted. And history hates women who act. She is compared to Eleanor of Aquitaine, to Catherine de' Medici, women who moved power in rooms where they weren't invited. And every time, They were called dangerous. Never capable, never visionary, only dangerous. But Margaret did not poison her enemies. She did not burn heretics. She did not usurp the throne for herself. What she did was refuse silence. And in doing so, she paid a price history rarely demands of men. Her name was written in shadows, her victories forgotten, her grief mocked. And yet, we remember men like Richard of York as protector, Warwick as the kingmaker, men who raised arms, spilled blood, and shattered oaths with less cause than she. They are remembered as bold, she vicious. Why? Because Margaret's battlefield was motherhood. Because her crown was stained by survival, not succession. And that unsettled history. She lost everything, but never once apologized for fighting. Her son died with a sword in his hand, not in exile. Her husband died a king, not a puppet. And her own body rotted in peace, not in public. But the judgment never stopped. To this day, biographies still debate her sanity, her methods, her motives. Was she cruel? Yes, at times. But power requires sharpness, and mercy was never extended to her. Was she ambitious? Yes. But what is ambition when your child is hunted? Was she political? Absolutely. Because politics was the only language men respected. Strip away the thrones, the wars, the heraldry, and what remains is a woman with a bleeding core, standing alone against the crushing weight of a kingdom. She loved, she lost, she broke, she endured. And that is what history cannot quite resolve. Because Margaret of Anjou does not fit. She is not a hero, not a villain, not a victim, not a saint. She is all of them, and none. A woman torn in half by war, stitched together by rage and maternal devotion, and left to decay in a world built to erase her. And so, we ask again, was she a she-wolf, or simply a mother howling against the dying of her son? There is no grand mausoleum, no towering statue, no stained glass window where her face glows holy in the light, no museum that bears her name, no throne room that honors her voice, just a grave, a quiet, unmarked slab of history in Angers Cathedral, France. She lies beneath stone that has forgotten her weight, in a chapel few pilgrims ever visit, tucked between altars built for men who ruled more gently or less loudly. There is no crown on the coffin, no rose carved in marble, just letters. Margaret d'Anjou, not Queen of England, not mother of the Prince of Wales, not last of the House of Lancaster, just a name, like any other. Even her portrait is difficult to find. Most surviving images are imagined, painted centuries later, idealized, politicized, or worse, demonized. The real face has vanished. No painter stood beside her in the tower. No artist captured the lines etched by loss. Her true likeness is dust, scattered in scrolls, rewritten by scribes who never heard her speak. And yet, traces remain. But they are not in stone. They are not visible. They are deeper, colder, etched in absence. At Dampierre-sur-Loire, the manor where she spent her final hollow years, the walls still stand, bare, weathered, forgotten by tourists. Most who pass do not know she once walked there barefoot in the dark, murmuring her son's name to the trees. There is no plaque, no velvet rope, just ivy and silence and cracked brick. Inside Angers Cathedral, no priest reads her story. No sermon draws from her sorrow. But if you look close, you might see a small, square tile on the floor, just wide enough to kneel on. That is where they say she rests. The woman who once altered the fate of England, now buried beneath the feet of strangers. Even the English crown bears no mark of her. Her royal seal has long been melted, recast, replaced by newer reigns. No artifact of hers is displayed in Westminster. No shrine in the Tower. No portrait in Windsor. Her enemies are immortalized. Her allies erased. And perhaps that, too, is a kind of monument, one carved by deliberate forgetting. Because Margaret of Anjou did not die a glorious death. She did not fall on the battlefield, arms raised, heart open. She died in exile, her legacy slowly starved into silence. And so England chose to forget her, not out of cruelty, but because remembering her would mean remembering everything she stood for. A queen who ruled in her husband's place. A mother who chose war to protect her child. A woman who refused to die quietly. That story was inconvenient. It didn't fit the romantic narratives. It couldn't be told in ballads. It couldn't be sold in fairy tales. And so, it was buried. Not just her bones, but her name, her voice, her fire. And yet, she lingers. Not in books of heroes, but in footnotes. In phrases like controversial queen, foreign-born consort, architect of civil war. They reduce her to roles. They don't call her what she was, which was enduring. She outlived the king, outlived the war, outlived the dynasty. And in doing so, she became something rarer than a legend, a silence that unsettles. Because some graves do not stay buried. Some names refuse erasure. Even without statues, even without crowns, even without songs. There is power in the places history forgets. In the corners of cathedrals, in the abandoned rooms, in the documents with lines scratched out, as if by nervous hands. There is power in a grave no one visits, because its silence becomes a question. What if everything we believed about her was wrong? What if she was not a she-wolf, but a shield? Not a villain, but a mother who howled too loud for comfort? What if all that remains of her now, a name, a shadow, a forgotten tile, is not absence, but resistance? Because to be erased, you must first be feared. And Margaret of Anjou was feared, even in death. What remains of a queen when the throne is gone? When the son is dead, the husband silenced, and the crown melted down into something worn by enemies? What remains? When memory itself becomes the battlefield. Margaret of Anjou ruled nothing when she died. No kingdom, no castle, not even the right to be remembered correctly. And yet, she remains. In the quiet rebellion of history, she lingers like a smudged fingerprint on the glass of a window no one cleans. There, but almost invisible. They erased her not by execution, but by exclusion. Not with gallows, but with footnotes. She was too powerful to praise, too inconvenient to canonize, too female to be forgiven. And still, she haunts the very architecture of monarchy. She was a warning, a precedent, a figure they dare not elevate, but cannot quite bury. Because Margaret broke the rules, not the written laws, those were written by men, but the unwritten code that queens must endure quietly, that they must serve but not speak, carry children but not carry armies, that they must never want except to please. Margaret wanted too much, and when the world refused her, she bit back. I think about her often, about the girl who stood on the deck of a ship bound for England, salt wind in her hair, 15 years old, too young to know that she was sailing not toward power, but toward erasure. I think about the woman who rode into battle not behind her husband, but instead of him, who stood in the mud of Wakefield and ordered the execution of the men who would have strangled her son's future in its crib. I think about the mother who outlived her child and somehow kept breathing anyway. That takes a kind of strength I hope I never have to understand. And I wonder, if we walked into that quiet cathedral in Angers and pressed our ear to the stone that holds her name, would we hear it? That low, quiet whisper? Not a scream, not a curse, not even a demand. Just this: I was here, I mattered, and you knew it. Because history is not just what is written, it is also what is hidden, in the ruins, in the stories untold, in the women turned to shadows because their light once burned too brightly. Margaret of Anjou was not a saint. She was not gentle, not forgiving, not even always right. But she was real. She bled, she lost, she rose, she shattered. And in her brokenness, she revealed what power truly costs. When you are a woman who dares to wield it, so no, there is no monument, no velvet-draped legacy. But if you stand still long enough, beneath that cold French sky, beside the river where she once prayed to ghosts, you might feel it. The echo of a voice that refused to be small, a voice that once defied kings, that once screamed a son's name into the mouth of death, that once sang lullabies to the bones of a dynasty. And in that echo, you may find the most honest truth history ever offers. That power, when held by love, always leaves a scar.